time for me to catch the second half of the girls' game.
Which game?
The girls' game.
Oh.
Actually, I have to.
So Amherst Media, we're ready. So, seeing a presence of a quorum of the Amherst School Committee, I'm calling us to order at 6:34 p.m. on Tuesday, January 24th. Since we are in person, we don't have to take a roll call, but we do have one member calling in remotely. So I'm just going to ask Irv that you let us know that you can hear us and that we can hear you.
I definitely can hear you, and I assume you can hear me.
Yep, we can. Can the audience hear him? Okay, great. Good, so our first item is minutes, but we do not have any minutes to approve. Can I ask, Mike, do we have somebody
So,
who's going to be taking minutes from the recordings?
yeah,
Yeah, because it's not, the person who would take minutes can't be physically present, so it's going to have to be from the recordings if we're going to be in person.
With that, we'll move on to public comment. Members of the public are invited to submit public comment either through email to scpubliccomment@arcs.org, through voicemail, or through text message ahead of time, or by participating live. So we did not receive any email or voicemail, so I'm just going to look and open up the floor to folks who are here, if anybody would like to speak at public comment. Seeing none, then we'll move on to the superintendent's update. So
Sure.
Over to you, Mike.
Thank you. So the first thing is thanks to Amherst Media for working this out, and Mike and Jerry from our IS staff who left not long ago after a long day to make sure everything was running. And I'll plug Amherst Media also. They're going to encourage us to speak at a reasonable distance from the microphone, probably a little closer than when most of us, I just moved mine a little closer, have it, particularly, depends how your voice carries, if you're masked and all that, but just to make sure it projects well. So thank you to Amherst Media for all your work with us. We had a booster clinic last week that was put on by the state that we held on that Friday, which had 175 people vaccinated. 56 of those were children under 18. Everyone who got vaccinated got a $75 gift card to Cumberland Farms, which for many of us, unless you drive an electric car, perhaps is the same as money because that's where you go. So thanks to W. Smorland, who really spearheaded the effort, they were really happy. We got a lovely email, which I shared with the school committee, just that they felt like the clinic felt that it went well. And thanks to Earl Miller's team at Crest for providing additional just crowd management when people are coming in and out and all those things. The next thing I'll say is, very sadly, we had a passing of a parent at Wildwood. It's now been shared publicly. I just want to acknowledge that someone who's been involved in our community, both at the school and the town level. So I just wanted to offer if we could share a moment of silence for that individual. Thank you. And I also want to thank the Wildwood staff and families who are doing a tremendous amount to support that family who's grieving and the child in our district. Everyone stepped up with GoFundMe and making sure the family has what they need, both in the short term, but also trying to think about support systems more longitudinally. So just want to share my appreciation for everyone in our community who stepped forward in that very tragic situation. Couple other things. I got a lovely message, hopefully Tammy and Julio did as well today, from the League of Women Voters. In the summer, Fort River is gracious enough to host their book fair, and just a note of appreciation for how much it means to the League of Women Voters to have that opportunity and have a really good site. So thank you both for all that you've done and making sure that they've felt supported. Also at Fort River last week, there was Community Day, which was an opportunity to break the typical routines. Granted, we're doing a lot of that this week, but break the typical routines that we sometimes fall in after the kind of holiday season for many. And just a lot of different activities where students had a little more choice, or a lot more choice in what they did throughout the day, and feedback anecdotally was it was very well received. It was really about building those connections that sometimes, you get into your routines, and if we don't focus on those connections, they don't always occur in the way we want. So a really successful day. This Friday at Crocker Farm, it's Martin Luther King Day celebration. Kind of a little different than some years past. It's in person, not virtual, but broken up into segments, so it's not everybody in the cafeteria all at once. But it goes on throughout the morning. If any committee members are interested, I can gather the schedule and send it over. But it's a lovely event. Some of you experienced it in different roles and ways, and community members or employees. And I'll be over there at some point in the morning because it's something I really miss about being the principal there, even though it's been a long time. At Wildwood also, Martin Luther King Day and Day of Service assemblies. They're also having African American read-in coming up in next month at Wildwood. And in terms of principal search kinds of things, at Wildwood we sent a survey out because as you know, as we talked about here, Nick Yaffe is retiring, looking for what kind of leader the Wildwood community of staff and families are interested in. We'll build a leadership profile, get that posted in the next couple weeks. at Fort River, consistent with actually what was mentioned last week at a different meeting, at a region meeting, when we have someone in the interim role who the superintendent deems has been successful in that role, we do a survey out to the community to assess the thoughts and feelings about that individual and whether that individual should be placed in a permanent role. And so that survey went out in the last week, within the last week, and it's open till the, I think it's February 2nd or 3rd, whatever that Friday is, and we'll look at the results of that. So that's the same was used at the high school. I know it's not this district. That ended up with Principal Sadiq becoming Principal Sadiq and not interim Principal Sadiq. So we put out to the community, we gather feedback, and we then make a determination. So that's where we are with the principal searches in the Amherst Public Schools. Finally, as people will find out soon, there will be an early release day tomorrow. We'll look for your email in the next hour for times. If I'm a little divided in my attention tonight, I apologize. Luckily, the cell phone reception is historically terrible, as it always was in this space. So relying on Google Chat and other things. But we will, we've given the forecast, we will have an early release tomorrow to make sure that our buses can get out before snow starts accumulating more than we would like it to. We feel like it's safe both for student drivers as well as for buses in the afternoons. And that is, I think, the end of my update.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Jennifer?
Mike, you mentioned a survey was sent out regarding the Wildwood principal search. And who did the survey go out to?
Staff and families, staff and current families of Wildwood
And
students.
great. And will we get to see the results of that? I would just be curious to see
Yeah.
what was asked and what the results were.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think we'll just have to think about if people put confidential information in there and talked about individuals. But yeah, no, and then you'll see that a leadership profile gets built from that.
Great. And then you said something about someone in an interim role and a survey going out. What I missed what that was about.
Sure. So when Doreen was here, we was at a region meeting last week, but the same applies across our districts. There was that group that met in 2017, 18, something like that, and they determined, and we've followed that since then, that when we have an administrator in an interim role that we feel like there has been successful in that role, that we go out to the community, ask for their impressions, staff and current staff and families, and if there is strong support for that person dropping the interim tag, then they drop that. If there's not, then we open up a search.
And did you say who that was about?
Oh yeah,
I missed.
I mean, it's awkward. She's here. Hey, Tammy.
Okay.
But you know,
I wasn't
but,
sure
yeah, yeah.
what you meant. Okay.
You know, she's living in an awkward world. Tammy and I spoke about it earlier. That you know, she's living in this, you know, sort of awkward space of a survey having gone out, and she's doing it with aplomb. So well done, Tammy, for hanging in there, and we'll let you know the results of that. As we have in the past, if it's an unsuccessful, if we get feedback that makes us open up, we're not going to necessarily go down the road of sharing. If it's feedback that drops an interim tag, then we do share that feedback with the larger community.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry I wasn't clear on that. My apologies. Again, I've a little divided attention. When it gets to
Sure.
presenting tonight, I promise I'll be all in on this. So.
Okay.
Any other questions? Peter?
The vaccination stats are amazing. Really, really great. I mean, obviously a fantastic collaboration between the town and the schools. Is that something we'll be able to do again, like, or periodically?
So
It seems like a success that we could build on.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. You know, Jennifer Brown and I were emailed. Jennifer Brown is the health director for the town of Amherst. They've done 2 sessions. They did one at the Bank Center, and they did one at the Craig's House? It might have been a Craig's House or Survival Center. I can't remember. I think it was at Survival Center. I apologize. I believe that's the case. And so the incentive certainly, you know, anecdotally is helping people who are interested but maybe, you know, get over that line. I don't think it's the thing that coerces people, right? Like I'm not getting any feedback of like, oh, I never thought of getting it and this is making me do it. It's much more, you know, I was sort of like wanting to do it and hadn't gotten around to it, and you know this is a good reason. So the question is, where's the saturation point? I don't know the answer to that. That's what Jennifer and I were emailing about. It's a little unclear to us. You know, we did open up, we filled up all the seats in the first round. We thought there was more demand. We opened up more seats. We didn't fill that many more. So there were additional seats that went unfilled. It's still a really high number that they weren't anticipating having, like when they look geographically at this area, how many other sessions there are. It's sort of interesting with the latest debate this week from the FDA about, you know, sort of annual boosters, perhaps, you know, before the fall. So, I'm not sure. I think we're in sort of a inflection point of how we think about boosters and vaccines, and so I think the time being, we're not hearing that there was demand that outstripped supply. I think we got who we were going to get, but I think as that moves forward and as the CDC and FDA kind of finalize their plan moving forward and recommendations, it may be something that we talk about, a little later on.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Irv, did you have any questions?
No, I didn't.
Irv, since I have you in a thumbnail, if you want to, you can hit the hand raise function and I'll see that. So if you ever.
All right. I was thinking.
Okay. No other questions? We'll move on to chair's update. And I don't have an update other than just a comment about, or a clarification about an article that appeared in the Gazette today that suggested that that was describing an action from the APEA against the Amherst School Committee and talked about actions with employees within the district, or the Amherst School District. And I just want to make a clarification because I don't think it's clear there that the Amherst School Committee is mentioned in this regard because the school committee is the employer of record. However, per policy and I think also statute, employee decisions, human resources and human resource management is all managed by the district staff. The school committee does not have direct authority or responsibility, frankly, for the management of individual staff within the school district. So I just want to make that clarification. Are there any other school committee updates or announcements? No? Great. So we'll move on to new and continuing business. And first up is our second quarter FY23 budget report. We have a couple budget topics. So this is this current year budget.
See if I can do this without Jerry and Mike here. That one I think is going. May need a second on this one.
I have a few hard copies we need. But I'll leave one of this up.
There we go. We got it up.
And for folks watching at home, it's on the screen, but it's also attached to the agenda on board docs. Go ahead.
Good evening, everyone. It's good to see you all in person. It's been a while. So needless to say, I'll just jump right into the second quarter report for the Amherst Public Schools. The short story is our budget's proceeding as expected. There are no extraordinary things that have us concerned at this moment in time. As far as our payroll, it's tracking right on pace with what we had projected, and so we're in good shape there. We might have a little bit of capacity in our contracted services because we shifted some of those summer costs, which is where we incur most of our contracted service costs, to some grants. But nonetheless, the primary part of our expenses relative to salaries is in that first salary line and is tracking on budget for the year. In our expense account, there's 3 areas that we have some concern about. We just want to keep an eye on them, really. I think there's one, English language education. We've got a much higher than expected need for translation services this year. I think with the university being fully back into its full swing, we're starting to see.
Doug, can you speak into the microphone a little more? I think Amherst Media
Sure.
can't quite hear you.
Okay. Is that a little better? What was I about to say?
I think you can probably raise it. I'm not sure it's designed for your height at the moment.
Hold on. That I know. Let's see. Let's see which slide I got.
There you go.
There.
There you go.
There we go. Is that better?
We'll see.
They'll tell us if it's not. We'll go on the positive assumption.
All right. So back to where I was. So 3 areas that we're really kind of keeping a closer eye on relative to our budgets as we go through the end of the year, through the second half of the year, I should say. In English language education, we're currently over budget as it currently stands. The fortunate thing is that the raw dollars are not that large, so it should be something that we can absorb in other parts of our budget. We've got a higher than expected level of need in translation services, so that's what we're seeing there. I think with the university sort of fully back into the post-pandemic or latter stages of the pandemic modality, we have a lot more variety of language which we're seeing. We haven't seen in the last couple of years, so a lot more unusual translations we needing to make to provide service to our students and families. So that's got that a little higher than expected. The other two areas are district-wide special education. It's really a matter of keeping an eye on that one. We do have resources we've applied by virtue of circuit breaker funds that we're applying to that to help level that off a little bit. But if there's an unusual uptick in the second half of the year, again, we'll have to look closely at other resources. But I don't anticipate that. But it is one we want to keep an eye on just because it's at a fairly high level of spending, which is not surprising. It's just a matter of keeping a close eye on that. And the third one is the facilities area. Again, we typically encumber or sort of prepare to spend throughout the year in that area of the budget in anticipation of buying floor wax and toilet paper and all those kind of things. But I think the thing that catches my eye and concerns me just a little is our spending is a little over 50% at this point, separate from the encumbered. If you just look at the raw spending, we're a little ahead of schedule there. So again, it's not that I'm that worried at this moment, but we do want to keep an eye on that spending as we go through the rest of the year. But by and large, as we look at the entirety of the budget as it sits at this moment, we're in good shape, and there's really no concerns or red flags that I'm that concerned about. And I'd happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Peter?
So, thank you for that, by the way. It's always nice not to see like a whole bunch of red, so that's well done. So we've budgeted for increases for staff that have not been contractually set yet, right? Like those contract negotiations for the contract that begins of July 1st last year, so retroactively, have not yet been applied. So is that reflected in the amount that's held in the control accounts here?
That is correct.
Okay.
That is correct.
So once those contracts settle, if they don't settle outrageously above estimate, then we'll be fine for that line?
That's correct as well.
And if they do settle outrageously above estimate, we'll what?
Well, that's when I sort of earn my keep, I guess. We'll have to look at other parts of the budget, areas of the budget that we haven't spent from in order to sort of recover some of that. If there are areas that do have some capacity to cover some of those costs. In the current state of affairs, we also, we have the luxury, I guess I would say, of some ESSER grant funds that might be able to be used in that regard. We've got a fair amount that's supporting this budget as is, just under $300,000. Are currently projected to be used for this budget in just plain budget support. So, it'll be a lot tougher if that's the circumstance. We hope that not to be the case, but again, we'll do as much as we can to kind of preserve those ESSER funds for use in subsequent years and leverage the resources we have in hand to cover that. But it would be require some significant belt tightening over the course of the second half of the year.
I can
Mike,
wait.
go ahead.
No, I can wait. Yeah,
Oh,
thank you.
okay,
Go ahead,
thanks.
Jennifer.
So Doug, you say here the town of Amherst appropriated an additional $125,000 to the school budget. That means the town allocated $125,000 more than they originally said to the school budget. And to what do we attribute that? I'm not complaining, but like, why did that happen?
So their estimates of revenues for the fiscal year 23 were they realized they were much better than they expected. So in the fall of this year, they appropriated an additional half a percentage point to all departments in the town, actually. So they had actually quite a bit of revenue above expectation that they then distributed kind of equally across all departments.
And does that happen very often? Or on a year-to-year basis, in your experience, has that happened before?
Not that often. I'm trying to recall a circumstance. I don't recall one.
Okay, great,
Similar.
thank you.
I can't remember one since I've been on the school committee.
Yeah.
No. Mike?
Yeah, so I think it's not directly a response to Peter's question, but something that I was going to add that Doug and I have spoken about is when we start thinking about next year's budget, which we'll talk about at an upcoming meeting, and we talked about a bit at our last Amherst School Committee meeting. One thing that we are looking as an option is to start reducing spending in the current fiscal year with the goal of decreasing how much ESSER we're spending. So in other words, you have to justify how you're spending ESSER money. You don't have to justify if you're like, no, we're good, we can charge that to appropriations. Right? There's no process except, Doug and Shannon working that out. And the advantage of being able to reduce spending this year to end by using less ESSER is it allows for more ESSER to be used in the next year and 2 months because it goes till September 24. So I just want to be clear that this is something we're looking at. There may be more on this in the next couple of weeks, but we're seeing that as a very viable strategy to, perhaps makes next year's budget less severe, Not because this year's budget is in such terrible shape. It's that if we can preserve those funds for longer, that makes the fiscal cliff more into, I used this term before, a fiscal hill. Rarely do I come up with a good term, and I think this one's okay, so I'm going to keep on saying it. I've used fiscal cliff enough in the last 2 years where, using that different nomenclature. So, I think it's reasonable to expect in the next couple of weeks when we dig in, now that we have second quarter budget, we may use a term we've used before is frost, so it's not a freeze in the budget, but it's trying to reduce spending except for sort of core essential instructional and other activities, so that at the end of the year we can hopefully put a fair bit of money that we were planning on ESSER use, as was referenced earlier, and not use it this year, which increases the amount that we have left for the year and 2 months following. So we think it's a pretty sound strategy, short-term pain, but you may be reducing longer-term challenges that are the scope of which are very significant. So if that happens, I just don't want this to get confused, because I know, typically we reduce spending when we are over budget for a fiscal year. We are not over budget for fiscal year. It's where we want to be. But we think that's an effective strategy when we're thinking about the long-term health of the district instead of the last, few months of a fiscal year where some belt tightening might help us out in the next year and a quarter. Doug, did I miss anything there? Okay.
So interesting. To follow up on that, so would you? So I understand the idea, and it sounds good for FY24. But to reference this fiscal, I don't know, estuary hill. What are we calling it now? So those 2 fiscal years, right? After in FY25, FY26, after next year, but prior to hopefully, fingers crossed, building coming on board and realizing efficiencies. That still exists, right? And so if you use a lot of ESSER for next year, for FY24, right, for say salary, right, you are increasing your base salary for FY25 and FY26. In other words, you're obligating more onto the budgets for those years. So unless you use that one-time ESSER money for truly one-time things, you're just increasing the base salary. So it's great for FY24. But, then, whatever the COLA comes in or whatever the increase, whatever inflation is for, what have you, if you use that, you don't have that for things that because you have to pay salaries every year. That's not an option.
Can I is it okay to respond to that? So we have thought about that, but there are other ways we could do it. We can reduce school choice spending for a year to then, again, smooth out that transition that you're talking about. So it's not necessarily just reducing a potential deficit. It's also, can we use this, eventually it'll come back up. Sorry about that. Can we kind of move the funds so that they last longer? Not necessarily that next year is going to be wildly better, because I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. But, as we talk about, I'm worried about next year, but I'm really worried about fiscal 25 and 26. So, there are other funding sources that we have some more flexibility on, that if we tap less for a year, we may be able to access them a little more in those 2 fiscal years that are the highest levels of concern. But I did not say that out loud, so you wouldn't have known that. So thank you for asking the question and prompting me. Sorry about that.
And just to tie it up in a bow, just forgive me for being slow.
No, please.
What you're referencing as other sources is things, unrestricted sources like school choice tuition, which comes to the district and with no strings attached.
Right,
okay.
And we spend,
Yep.
Absolutely. So that's the hope, but we do feel like if we are able to save some funds this year, there's a real way, to sort of use it more gradually, that may make things a little less hard, in coming months. Dismissal call is made and out, so I can be fully present. Elementary students are going to be dismissed at noon tomorrow, and secondary students at 1. I know it's an elementary meeting, but I feel like they may have siblings, so it's relevant for families. So I can now be more fully attentive. So
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Doug.
Thanks, Doug.
Next is the 6th grade to ARMS timeline and
Yep.
recommendation.
let me see if I can pull this up actually in a little bit of a different format. Give me 1 second. Still adjusting. I think this is the way I'm going to use it because I think it'll take me a while to pull it up in a Google Slides sheet. So we'll go from here. So 2 weeks ago, I came with a pretty big curveball, and I think what was a plan that had been talked about and discussed in multiple iterations along the way. So I want to bring an update and tonight a recommendation. To be clear, I'm not asking or requesting the school committee vote tonight. I think that would be not give the committee nor the community enough time to weigh in, but we do have some data and some information, particularly as it relates to Fort River and space. Thank you for Tammy and Julio for being here. They can certainly help out with some thoughts about space in Fort River because we talked about that last time, so I appreciate their presence this evening. Okay. So here's a summary of a longer presentation made 2 weeks ago. Right, the primary reasons we talked about moving 6th grade are the developmental needs of students, the Amherst Elementary building project, and a lack of space at the elementary schools that's primarily due to COVID-related changes that we made at Fort River and Wildwood in those 2 school buildings by taking down walls and making some other changes. So the additional new considerations that I spoke about last time, and this is literally copy and pasted from the last presentation, so apologize for boring people who were watching that. But I think it's good to restate and provide the context is that our budget projection is quite significant in terms of the projected deficit for the next fiscal year. That our elementary enrollment has declined beyond what the expectations were made, and we were basing this choice. And due to the separate districts and sort of the bureaucratic challenges, when we looked at moving to 4 elementary schools, there was a number of staffing and financial implications that played out in a way that made us pause. Not that we don't think that 6th graders, or I don't think, 6th graders won't benefit from being in a middle school environment, but the current model and some of the bureaucratic challenges have created, what I would say is an inefficient model from a staffing and fiscal perspective, not talking about the education. So the key question I raise is it feasible, questions I should say, is it feasible to delay the move till fall of 26, that being when, knock on wood, the building project is completed, and if we can do it, is in the best interest of our students, right? So it's 2 distinct questions. There's a conditional in there, but they are distinct, and based on updated information about staffing, space, and budget. So I want to be clear on this slide that we did not explicitly ask for feedback with the exception of students in any way. So this initial feedback received came from our communication, not from any formal feedback mechanism. I think it's important to note that. So staff, there was generally positive response, and for 2 reasons. One is for folks who are really excited, who are planning to be in the 6th grade in the middle school, they would like to see, there was a lot of interest expressed about could we be more integrated. There was a kind of like concern that they were sort of siloed off from a curricular perspective, a teaching and learning perspective, and a collaborative perspective from the middle school. And so they were hoping that they'd have more opportunities, or we'd have more opportunities to figure out, even if students were in a somewhat separate wing, how could we think a little more about it as a 6th through 8 middle school? And I appreciate that because I think that's spot on. I think what's not on the slide also is some folks were interested in having a little more time before making a decision to offer a preference about 6th grade. They wanted, not that they felt rushed, but just, things are still under development and people felt like they wanted to weigh in a little bit more, or more information. And the second, and probably the more primary thing that I received is the budget implications felt very real for staff. I think they intuitively, in many ways more than me, understood the inefficiencies that would be created from having 4 schools, and they sort of got that, that was going to not necessarily minimize the impact of the reductions if people were spread across 4 buildings instead of 3. So I received a lot of feedback about that. 5th grade students met with their building leader or leaders on that Friday. I think it was it's on here, the 13th, ironically maybe. And so there was a really mixed reaction. There were students who felt relieved, and then there were students who were very upset. They really were excited. They were thinking about all the opportunities about that. They were thinking about being in school with siblings and friends who are a little bit older. They were excited about world language. They were excited about some of the other opportunities that they perceived. And just being in, they felt like it was the approach, one piece of feedback, it feels like the right school for us. We're big kids, you know, and so, you know, there was some students, again, who felt much more positive, relieved. We get to be here another year. That's great. But there is a GoFundMe apparently being formed by some Crocker Farm fifth graders to try to raise $800,000 to do the budget gaps. I was asked to let know about that. You know, and I did hear, I know Tammy and Julio are here tonight, but it was pretty much the same story at all the schools. That it was really mixed, right? Some students very relieved, happy, some students very disappointed. And I think whatever happens, that's great feedback to think about what sixth grade is going to look like wherever it ends up being. You know, if sixth grade does end up staying in the elementary school next year, I think it's incumbent on us to think about how do we make that year feel extra special and different, maybe even different than how we've thought about it before for this particular group of students. Families, you know, we emailed everybody through the newsletter. We also sent an explicit email to fifth grade families with the same information, but we wanted to highlight it because we know not everyone may see the newsletter, and we wanted to send more directly. And again, much like students, there was a real mixed reaction. Some families feeling very relieved. They had some anxiety about their child going to the middle school and being the first year of this change, which is always a challenge for families. You know, from a bureaucratic administrative level, when we make a change long term, but from a parent level, it's their kid's opportunity to be in sixth grade that child only gets once. And so, you know, being the first year to make a change is not always the easiest. Like I think of the first year Comandante's kids, and it felt so different in terms of the anxieties of the families than it does now, you know, and people make whatever choices they want to make with Comandante's, but the first year there was so much energy, and even there was excitement, it was like the first year, and is it going to be okay? And by now, you know, it's a mature program with 4 grade levels, and people are either excited or they're not, and they make a choice, but it's not the same energy level. So I really want to acknowledge that for families, and some families said they'd done significant work talking to their kids about the change, and you know, had some thoughts about that. And then we had families who said, we're relieved, thank you, right? And I think this is the right thing for my child to finish out their career at elementary. So again, these are all anecdotal in terms of the staff and families, because we didn't ask explicitly. The students, we did, you know, there was a session, you know, with their principals, and they were, you know, it wasn't a formal survey, but they were able to talk about it, and apparently still talk about it and fundraise and all the things that they're working on, which, yeah, we like activists, so that's a good thing. So before I go on to kind of space, budget, and staffing, I didn't know if there was any questions that anyone had so far. I know this is a longer presentation than I usually make, but it's a pretty weighty topic for me and I think for us. Okay, I'll keep going. By the way, this presentation was emailed to all elementary faculty this afternoon once I finally stopped obsessing and got it 100% finished. And we'll put in the newsletter on Friday as well for families. Space. So Wildwood and Crocker Farm, right? We anticipate reduced space needs. We also are going to complete, at least partially, if not fully, the Crocker Farm cubby removal project, which will make those classrooms have quite a bit more usable space. We're hoping to get it all done this summer. If we don't, we certainly can get the rooms that we anticipate having the largest class size and getting that done this summer. We do anticipate getting the whole thing done, but we know that sometimes best laid plans, but we do have a plan B that would take care of a couple rooms anyway. At Fort River, we do anticipate an increase of 2 classrooms over the next couple of years, and we'll get into more details on this later. Right now, we do have 2 subdivided halvesies. I'll show a picture of what that looks like, because I know that's very coded language. That would continue. We have a lot of integrated spaces, which means halvesies where special ed and ELL staff are sharing a space with the classroom teacher. These are 1,900 square foot spaces, but from acoustic perspective, we put up a lot of sort of short walls and things like that to provide that. It's imperfect, but we do a lot of co-teaching, which works great for co-teaching, less great for sort of pull-out services. We currently are using 2 cafeterias as classrooms. We would plan to continue that, and that means lunches would be eaten in classrooms for most students at Fort River, which has an impact on custodial and paraeducator support as well. And in this projection, what we would look at is the art and music rooms would no longer be art and music rooms. So if we think of increasing by 2 classes, those are the spaces that would go away. We do have examples of that. Wildwood had not had art and music in their classrooms last year, so we do know how that works, but it really does affect the program if you're on a cart versus in your own classroom. So that's sort of some of the implications there. These are the projected number of classrooms that we'd have over the next couple of years. Obviously, the projections, they'll change as enrollments change, but you could see a reduction from the current year at Crocker Farm and Wildwood and an increase at Fort River. I think maybe I'll go through the space slides and then pause because there's a lot in these, if that's okay. So this is what the current subdivided halvesies look like at Fort River. Three of us went on a tour last week. I think it was last week. One's a set of third grade classes. One's a set of fifth grade classes. For those of you who had kids go through or know Fort River and Wildwood well, this will bring you back. Right now, the walls, as you can see, don't come close to the ceiling, and that's for ventilation. We have been in conversations with Rupert Roy Clark, our facilities director, about what we potentially could do that would go up to the ceiling and maintain ventilation. It would involve some reformatting and rebalancing of HVAC systems in those two spaces. It would also involve potentially having 2 air purifiers running it all the time in both quads, which it's white noise, but it is noisy. So one of the things we have to think about is that noise better than the noise that our current setup has? So that's something we're exploring. We're not making a commitment to, but Rupert had some creative thinking about ways we might be able to do this and still maintain ventilation. It's suboptimal. It's currently suboptimal. And so those are some of the conversations that we're having. We do believe that it's likely that our own staff could take care of this. So in terms of cost, we could look at ARPA or other funding sources. That would not be a huge cost, I could say. But we did get to talk to a couple of the teachers who are sharing those halvesies and these current models. It seemed like the younger students, their bodies are so much smaller. The fifth graders, it felt busier. Also matters the class sizes. So in the third grade room, the class sizes are quite small right now, where the subdivided halvesies are. In the fifth grade, they're a little bit larger, and you definitely could feel the difference walking through about how that worked. Here's a map. We're focusing on Fort River primarily because the other schools, we don't feel like the space needs are significant, not that we don't care about them. So here's a map, we think, at 22 classrooms. If you're thinking of where you walk in, this is sort of where you walk in. Yes. This grade 6 room that's over here is where the art room is. So if you're thinking that you are familiar with walking into Fort River and the art room's on your right, that's the first room. And so you can see that pretty much every room is used. We have an office for the art teacher, so they have a room for their space, much like we have for technology and some other spaces right now. But that's imperfect. You can see that subdivided halvesies are up here. In this model, we look at second and third grade, where there would be, again, suboptimal, but possible. We maintain one cafeteria, both for music and capacidad usage. So the music room, music class could possibly be meeting there when, you just have to remember that the cafeteria lunches, there's kids coming through, or, there's lots of traffic going both ways. So it's not ideal when we get up to 22 classes there. But to answer our first question, we do believe it's feasible. So a couple things that came up in our team's discussion, but in the team, I don't just mean Tammy and Julio, I mean all of our principals and district directors who have been talking about this. One thing we thought about is, well, couldn't we just shift some Fort River students from, in general, shift students to other schools to reduce some sections? Like, one of the ideas is, what about kindergarten? We just don't have 3 kindergartens, we only have 2 or something like that. So the challenge with that is that we have both 2 specialized programs there. We have the Ames program and the Building Blocks program. And we also have the Comandantes program there. And so we would be reducing access to one or both of those programs, and that didn't feel consistent with how we approach things in our district. It also creates additional transportation challenges to get a group of students who may be spread out. Fort River is a really large catchment area geographically. It goes from Amherst Woods all the way up to the Shutesbury border, or close to it, up in, Shutesbury border. And so, we looked at mapping that out and the additional cost of the driver and a bus, and it didn't seem feasible to us. So another suggestion that we received is, could we move specialized programs, one or both of them, from Fort River? We end up with some similar problems. So we have multiple students who are in Comandantes and in specialized program, and so we'd be forcing them to choose whether to stay in Comandantes or to not receive their services and change their special ed grid, and we just didn't feel like that was we couldn't do that to anyone. So, sort of, it was a nice idea, we explored it, and by nice I mean truly it came from staff, like, could we do this? And the other thing that we talked about is, for some of our more vulnerable students, it'd be adding, potentially 2 transitions in 4 years. Like, if you have a kindergartner, they'd make this transition for first grade. A couple years from now, they could transition, to a different school and then transition to middle school a year later. It would add a lot of transition to some of our more vulnerable students. The last we looked at is adding a mobile classroom or some setup at Fort River. It's really expensive. Donna Denisco, who's one of our the lead designer or lead person at their design firm, she does this a lot for renovations, and so we got a cost estimate. I mean, it's 6 digits. It's large. And then it would really take away the outdoor play space, which, if you think of Fort River, hopefully it's a construction site and not so long. So we are going to lose some outdoor play space there. So the idea of losing outdoor play space, accessibility issues of getting there, which is always going to be a consideration, we just didn't find that it was worth exploring. The bang for the buck just wasn't there, and the impact on outdoor play just didn't feel like it was quite worth it. We do have some experience in the district. We did have a space at Marks Meadow, old in the district. I go back that far. And what we found is the accessibility issues were a challenge. I mean, if we lived in a warm, sunny climate all year, maybe that'd be fine, but just it wasn't attached to the building. Not everyone could get there. So, if you think about a specials, because that was one of the ideas, could a specials room like art or music be there? But then if you're mobility challenged, can you not get to the art room? And it led to we couldn't resolve some of the challenges, and for the amount of money it would cost, we didn't feel like it was a viable strategy. So to summarize, Wilden and Fort River, we're not so concerned about space. Fort River, we are, and the needs will become more pronounced, as I said, by larger classes and being a construction site. And we'll have to closely monitor what resources are needed. And we do think it's feasible that map, we think it's feasible to have the students at Fort River for the 3-year period. If it was a long-term plan, I would have a different opinion. But we do believe we can make it through 3 years with this model, and just understanding some of the implications for Fort River. That was a mouth or earful, depending on your perspective, but I'll pause there and see what questions you have for me or for Tammy and Julio. Again, thank you for being here.
Peter?
So thank you for that. Yeah, I guess just at a detail level, certainly the space crunch at Fort River obviously stands out as one of the biggest concerns. So yeah, I'd love to hear from our leadership team, just to get their current take on how they feel about, after having sort of soaked in the problem for a while, like what the viability feels like in terms of, what are the pain points we need to look at. We're not going to have 22 classes next year, but it's if we go in that direction, what do we need to plan for? Are there lessons learned maybe from the space, the major space changes we already did for COVID that apply here, or how it's going with some of these things? I mean, some of these things on paper maybe look a little more concerning than in reality. When you say classrooms in a cafeteria space, you think of, I don't know, bananas flying around the room, but that's probably not the case. Anyway, I would just love to hear their perspective.
Sure. Yeah.
I think-
Well, go ahead.
I second that, but before you answer, because I think that was sort of where my questions were going to, and so I'd love to. So the space map is showing 25, 26, and so when we talk about sort of for 3 years, really this is 1 year, and so my question is sort of like, it's like there's going to be a pain next year, a little bit more than next year, and a little bit more than next year. So if you could describe a little bit about sort of what does that look like next year, and in between, because this is not what it's going to feel like for 3 years, is the question. So.
And just because we're speaking informally, but if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself just for people who may be watching and may not be as familiar with who you are.
I'm Tammy Sullivan Daly. I am the interim principal at Fort River Elementary School.
Hi, my name is Julio Fernandez. I'm the assistant principal at the Fort.
So to address your question first, next year we will have 20 classrooms again, so we will maintain the same spacing that we have this year. The following year, 2024, 2025, we'll have an additional class. And where we're thinking right now is we would put the additional 5th grade there, because right now we currently have 4 3rd grades, so next year we will have 4 4th grades. So by the time that we get to, there we go, 2025, 2026, we'll be at 22 classrooms, because each year Commandante is growing, so that definitely has a impact on how many classrooms we need. This year we also have 2 grades that are only 2 classes, right? We have 5th grade and 4th grade. So as they're moving up and moving out, we're also gaining another grade level as well. So, you know, as you noted, by the time we get to 2025, 2026, we will then use what is currently the music room to offset the classrooms.
The reality is that we have to be cognizant that movement causes stress in our staff, and how we created this map and this plan is for have the less amount of movement during the next 2-3 years.
Julio? I'm sorry, the feedback I was getting before is the closer, especially on that mic, the closer you are to it, the more clear it goes. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So basically, as Tammy mentioned, next year is going to be similar amount of classrooms as this year. The reality is that we only have one movement, and it's related to the classroom that will be put on the cafeteria, on the music room, pardon me. And the next couple of years, we'll be adding just one classroom, but for example, art will continue to have the space until the last year. So basically, the last year is the last year that it will be more encouragement when it comes to art and music, because they won't have those spaces. But the year before that, there's going to be a space for art, for music, and the year before that, there's going to be spaces for both classes.
Any other questions?
I think that Peter had a question. It was related to space, but if you can ask the question again.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, the closest analogy in my mind to this is what we did at COVID, right, where we suddenly had to shift and we really realigned the space there and encountered a lot of the same issues that we're probably going to encounter here in terms of, you know, how do we, like you were talking about with the ventilation and wanting to keep those standards up and moving some of the specials classes around and using some, having classes in non-traditional spaces. I was just wondering, sort of like, are there lessons learned from that process, you know, that we anticipate will make this smoother? You know, it's because it looks manageable and responsible on paper, and I'm just sort of wondering, you know, like, do we feel like we have like the lived experience now that we've sort of like tried to work creatively in the Fort River space for as long as we have?
It's interesting because from 1973 to until 2020, we had classrooms on those quads. It was basically houses in each space. And I have to say, and Tammy will agree with me, our staff, we have the best staff in the business. We have resilient staff that are very flexible, the same as our kids. And I know that the teachers will do their best to accommodate to the needs of our students. It was possible now with the idea of having division that will go all the way up. I think it's going to be manageable for our students, manageable for our teachers.
I would have to agree, having taught in Fort River when we had a quad space with having to teach alongside 3 other teachers teaching simultaneously, that was certainly a challenge. So I have to say, teaching in a halvesy or even teaching in a full half of a quad is drastically different and really does support many of our learners. And I think that one of the things I want to emphasize is that by placing 2nd grade and 3rd grade closer will allow for more teaming at those grade levels. Right now, second grade is currently where you would see third grade comandantes. And so that classroom is really spread further from our team, making it a little more challenging to really collaborate and work in collaboration with one another. As it pertains to like the actual move, I think teachers feel really, I think one of the things we learned is we can eat outside. We can do things we hadn't really thought of before, and I think teachers really see that. Having done lunch duty myself and not accessing the cafeterias and eating lunch in the classroom has been really lovely because it's really reduced how many behavioral issues that we have. Students this year are really excited to eat in the cafeteria, and we're seeing a lot of great things there. So.
I think one of the questions that I have, you referenced play space. I would just say, this feels like it's, I wouldn't even call it lemonade, but it might be like, slightly sweetened lemon juice out of lemons, because it's not, we need to do something, and yet this still doesn't feel good. Like, it's not a great solution. I just want to, the students and the staff at Fort River are going to be scrunched, and they're also going to be enduring a large construction project that's going to impact their drop-off and pickup times. So it's a lot, I think, that we're asking, and it's it's great that Wildwood and Crocker Farm won't have the space issues, because when we first were looking at it, it was all of our schools were having issues, and yet I feel like we're sort of doubling down on the pain for the community at Fort River, and so I don't think there's any better answer. So I get that, but I don't want us to sort of sugarcoat this and sort of paint this as a happy picture. So I want to understand a little bit more about the comments about the space, and I understand the restrictions on a mobile classroom, or the concern about that from an accessibility perspective. But I want to ask, are there other spaces? We're addressing sort of creatively thinking about the cafeterias as potential classrooms. Are there other spaces in the building that could be potentially converted to classroom space to enable, and move that into a mobile unit or a mobile office, right? That sort of frees that a little bit. And I hear you about this space, but I just pulled up the last site plan that we saw, and it looks like, most of that is the fields, not necessarily the play spaces that are sort of behind the school and I guess on the north side of the school, which my kids went to Fort River. So I'm just curious about sort of to push that a little bit more on sort of really understanding that, because if we do make this decision, it's not great for Fort River. So I hear you, it's the best staff and it's a great, and I but it's going to be a couple years of just pain, I think, and I just want to make sure that we're really pushing ourselves on sort of thinking around on that. Mike?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things that I'd say. We did talk about some other spaces. We thought, library is a very, very large space, but it's hard to figure out quite like how you'd orient, creating a kind of a separate space in there. So, we sort of, at this point, didn't feel like that was super viable, but, we're at the beginning part of this process, again, in some ways. I know there's a decision that's looming, but we haven't asked for, direct ideas or feedback. Some people have shared them because they had them. So I think in terms of the outdoor, like an additional, office or classroom, you can think about the blacktop, where there's basketball courts, or you can think right behind the school where there's grass area. So if you think of that, and I don't have that visual there, but for those of you who are thinking about this, what we lose in the construction is essentially what's back here. So the younger kid play area. If you think of that, everything directly behind the school where the classrooms are would remain, and there'd be a fence, and then everything to the south?
No.
South.
South, yeah.
Yep.
Everything to the south there, where there's a softball field over that way, there's a track over that way. That would be on the other side of the fence, which would be near construction. So So I think there is some concern, and as Tammy and Julio were saying, that our students are doing not just play outside, but learning outside as well. And so I think that's where we go, get a little confused. I think the other thing that I'm concerned about is the parking and the traffic, and I don't know what the recommendations yet are going to be. And I don't want to start hypothesizing because I really don't know. It's an honest statement, but I just worry about losing blacktop that may not be, may have other uses in the future, right? I don't know what the recommendations are going to be for the staging and where cars are going to go and all that. So that's the other reason I'm a little cagey about using space, because I know what space is going to be behind a fence, but I don't know where parent pickup and drop off are going to be. I'm not exactly sure where everyone's going to park, if there's enough spots for the current number of employees and families, and I don't want to lock myself in. I think, but to your point you made a little while ago, which was really helpful, we've got a little bit of time for this, because next year we're projecting the same number of classes as we have now. I think, folks are making it work. It gets a little more dicey in the future years, so we'll know more about the staging, and we have a little bit of time to, I think, work out some of those details and assess that. And we actually have architects who know an awful lot about mobile classrooms and how they would work, and they've offered their support to us to say, if you want us to be your experts, we can give you what we're doing, because especially in ad renos, there's often those are frequently used, and they've done plenty of those projects. So I don't know if you want to add anything, but that was my 2 cents at the moment.
To be clear, I'm, concerned particularly about year 2025, 2026, losing a play area, particularly for our young kids. So I think it's going to take some creative problem solving around that, right? I mean, if we've learned anything, we can be creative problem solvers for sure. When I think about additional classroom spaces, other than what Mike talked about in terms of the library, all the other spaces, while looking very similar sized on the map, aren't. They're much smaller spaces, and I really can't see a classroom of even 14 kids being in any of those other spaces.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think it's, I have talked to the town manager and the town finance director about the ARPA funds that were dedicated for the 6th grade move to the middle school, and potentially using them for supporting any costs that would come from keeping 6th grade students here, and it's still it's the same problem. It's just about a different solution, and there may be costs associated, because I think that play area thing is, looms large for me. I think that's very real especially for K-1 students.
Peter?
Yeah, so I'll just publicly endorse the idea of continuing an active conversation with the town of using some of the ARPA funds that were dedicated for the move. Because one of the notes I had here is, because we do have a little bit of time to plan before the number of classrooms increase, if there's small-time capital money that would make a significant difference in one or more of these spaces, then we should consider doing that. For exactly the point that Allison was bringing up, is because the difficulty of this space crunch is going to fall disproportionately on this community. And I know nobody in town loves the idea of, well, let's put more short-term money into a building that's not going to be there. Again, hopefully, in a few years. But the point is, but the reality is that 4th graders only get one shot at being a 4th grader, and 5th graders only get one shot at being a 5th grader, etc. Every year is important and valuable, and so it's not a wasted. If there was some amount of money that we invested that we weren't going to get back, it's not wasted money. It's an investment in that educational year, because as you've noted, there aren't other viable options to spreading out the population. It's definitely something that I would encourage all of us to keep on our radar, because the town was very generous with the amount of ARPA money that was dedicated, and if we don't need all that now, then that's certainly something we should look at.
Irv?
I wanted to reiterate what you said, Allison, and what Peter just indicated. I cannot imagine a more challenging teaching learning environment in the upcoming year and the year after that. And I also understand that the staff, Mike, all of you are doing obviously the best you can. But one thing that has to stay clear in all of our minds is that this is very, very suboptimal.
Thank you.
Should I transition
Yeah.
beyond space? Okay. So on to staffing. We are working on a rebalancing staffing plan to match the student enrollments across the 3 elementary schools. We're continuing to work at that, and so we don't have the full picture to show you, but it's very clear. A couple things become very clear. One is that rebalancing includes fewer changes or fewer shifts for staff with 3 schools than it does with 4 schools. And I think it also, complicating things, good follow-up to Irv's comment or segue, is that Fort River would gain staff under a rebalancing because their relative enrollment has increased. And as a result, there's some space implications of that as well. And I think it can't be the case that Fort River doesn't get enough staff to be balanced across the schools because of space needs. Like, that's not an acceptable answer. Like, yes, you based on population, you should have 1.5 of X role, but no, we can't find room for them. Therefore, you don't get, like, we can never go down that road. And we're having those conversations. We'll be able to share at the next school committee meeting a full kind of accounting of this. I think, I'm just going to summarize because some of this has been stated before, but it's more efficient across 3 versus 4 schools. And I think when we're looking about potential reductions, it's become clear to us and our leadership team that we think we can do a better job with future reductions, not just next year, but moving forward for the next 3 years, with 3 schools as opposed to 4. It just really stretches us to have staff across 4 schools and make reductions simultaneously. And one strategy for both budget and space that I think we're going to have to look at is reduce the number of classrooms. And the average class size under our projections, and they're on the next slide, so remains under 19 students a class. That's in terms of, I'm not talking about like tiny rural schools, but in terms of sort of schools in Hampden and Hampshire County. Sorry, my text loops for snow is getting me all mixed up because I'm on multiple ones. That's a remarkably low number. We are atypical to have a number that's less than 21, 22 of an average class size at elementary school, and under our projections, the average class size would be under 19 across the district, but there's more classrooms than we are typically have been used to between 22 and 24 students, and so as we look for, reductions and as we look about space, I think we do have to look of where we fit regionally, what evidence says about that, and it's not that I'm against lower class size, of course I'm not, but I think seeing the fiscal reality on the wall as well as the space needs on the wall, I think we do need to be really clear about that, and this is what our projections, they were updated 2 weeks ago, would look like. So the lighter colors are in white, and which is the current year, and the shaded blue are next year, fiscal year 24. So you can see that there is some difference between our districts, or between our schools within the district, but the first 2 are Fort River, so you can see an average class size of 18.65 projected, but in 5th grade, we would have 2 classes, and right now, if everything rolled forward, we'd have 24 students in each of those classes. That's actually current numbers. That's not a reduction. That's what we currently have in our 4th grade this year at Fort River. We've talked about that here, I believe, before. At Crocker Farm, you see class size going from 16.4 to 17.7 roughly, but you do notice a couple class sizes over 20 and one grade level that has classes of 23 and 24 in it in next year's 3rd grade. And at Wildwood, you see us going from 18 to about 20 as an average class size, and you see a number of classes around 20 and a couple at 22, 23, and in that. And again, regionally, nationally, those are if we shared this slide at most school committee meetings, anywhere locally or beyond, I think people would say, wow, you have really low classes. Your average class size is under 19. But I do want to note that this is a shift. This isn't what has always been the case in Amherst over the last 15, 16 years. I think if you go way back, you'll see very large class sizes, and then it shifted. And I do think both fiscally as well as space-wise, we may have to come to grips with having a couple sections and a couple in our schools that are a little larger than people have become accustomed to over the last decade or so. And so that's okay. I think I'll pause there on sort of budget and staffing because they sort of blended together, and see if there's questions.
Jennifer.
So, as you were saying, reducing, the idea of hypothetically reducing the number of classrooms means increasing class size. So, I would be open to discussing the idea of increasing class size, but I know that we have approved policies about the class sizes at varying grade levels. Would you propose changing those policies or having the school committee vote to change those policies? And would it be a temporary thing just for this awkward period or this difficult period until the new school opens, knock on wood? Or would it, or are you thinking it would be a more permanent, if we did go down that road, would it be a more permanent change?
Thank you. So, really good question. So, I do think they're guidelines. The policy has guidelines. They're not absolutes.
Okay.
So, I think it's worth talking about it in terms of policy. So, I think both things can be true, right? I don't think the policy needs to shift for us to have class sizes that look like what's on this slide, and I think it's a worthy conversation to have from a policy lens. I do think moving forward, when we're in a new school, I think we may have more flexibility that way, and things will be more efficient and they'll even out a bit more. Because if you put all these students together, in other words, if you looked at just like all the kindergartners together, you could be much more efficient with your sections, and moving from 3 to 2 schools, and especially with one being a bit larger, it really helped. And one of the things that's not reflected, it's hard to show on a slide, and Julio and Tammy manage this all the time. So for instance, let's look at this year's grade 3, next year's grade 4 at Fort River. So you have 4 sections and 64 kids. So if you looked at those classes, 2 are Comandantes, 2 are not. The 2 Explorers, and I'm going to say Explorers, the 2 Explorers classes, the class size is actually quite small, and we've increased it with school choice over the years to make it more viable, but it's because of the nature of Fort River right now with 2 Comandantes class and 1 Explorers class that leads to some awkward nature of class sizes, that when the Comandantes program is in a larger school and the Explorers classes, there's more Explorers classes than Comandantes, a lot of that will even out. So I think it's worth talking about from a policy level. I do think we'll get more efficient once the new building project, knock on wood, occurs. The challenge I have is fiscally. I'm not sure what's viable long term. So that's the piece that I struggle with the most in the conversation is we'll be more efficient, and yet what is the kind of willingness to, what's our ability to pay and to afford, class sizes that are, all under 20 or whatever kind of model that people might be interested.
Thank you.
Peter.
So I'm glad you brought it up. I do think that it is a good idea for the school committee to start putting on its radar, looking at our class size policy. So like Jennifer mentioned, we do have an actual voted policy. It was last updated 10 years ago, though. And so, our enrollment situation has changed in a decade, as has our financial situation. The constraints have only become more constrained. We have over $1.5 million of charter money that outflows that wasn't there at that level 10 years ago. And like you said, the context here is that even with the numbers we're talking about in a couple of years, our class sizes are still fantastic compared to the state, statewide. And it really is, still one of the signature calling cards of an Amherst public school education, I think, is that low student to teacher ratio, which gives students one of the greatest resources that we can provide, which is time with their teachers, right? And that attention. And so that it's not that we're losing that, but I do think that we do have to consider, are we in a new normal of a reduced ability to leverage the economy of scale? If we have 200 more kids in the school, we're able to operate more efficiently. We're able to save in other areas that allows us to fund staff. And so I think it's really difficult to say exactly what the policy should be, as we're in this what will be kind of a disruptive period in terms of being able to project, with the new building and all that. But, like for example, we have 17 to 21 students is the policy for K-1. And we have, 22 plus at Wildwood. So like that's those are the cells in this table grid that stand out to me. And I know some districts and many districts in the state would be head over heels for that level, in addition to all the other supports we provide, right, for our students. But compared to the rest of the cells, it does sort of stand out, and it's very difficult to, mathematically make that all work out, because you can't have 2.6 classrooms. You can only have whole classrooms, and so you get into very small numbers at that. But I do think at the end of the day, it's worth having the conversation, because we do have to, even if we do a fantastic job in the next 4 or 5 years and we make it through to in good budgets, we're going to have other budget years that continue to be difficult after the new building is online. And so it is probably a good idea for the school committee to start looking at it more regularly.
I think I'll also comment on the policy. I also would be in favor of taking a look at the policy, because 10 years ago, I don't think co-teaching was as prevalent as it is in our classrooms today. So that class size policy was written on the assumption that it would be primarily one teacher in the classroom, and now in many of our classrooms we have 2 teachers full-time in there. And so that's a very different scenario. It's just an article that I was reading was talking about a woman teaching first grade, and she had 26, 27 kids and was the only teacher in the room, right? Like, that's not what we're talking about when we talk about 22 kids in one of these classrooms. Is, for the most part, there's at least 2 adults in the room, if not more. So I think in recognition of the changes in sort of how we teach and educate our students, like re-looking at that class size policy, and thinking also about sort of how it's structured, because right now it's a range, and I think a lot of parents, myself included, when we had young kids in the district, look at that and think that means that, oh, well, 17, so my classroom should be 17, and if it's 21, then that's not good. Whereas, and I've seen other policies from other districts that write it in a sort of a different way, that sort of say, this is our target, this is when we will add another classroom, this is when we will take away a classroom. Mike?
Yeah, I think the last thing that I want to say on this topic is, I think you're right in what Peter mentioned about, the benefit of small sizes. I totally agree with. But I also want to be realistic that, like, when I was teaching at Fort River and I was in a quad that had 700 square feet of usable space, an interior quad which had a hallway in it, most of our teachers at Wildwood and Fort River, with the exception of the examples that we said before, are teaching in 1,900 square foot classrooms. Now, that creates some challenges as well as benefits, right? I mean, it's a large space, and at Crocker Farm, thanks to the idea that came from the school committee, we'll be increasing the usable space as well in those. So in terms of space, and not just COVID space, but just generally space to have kids in a room and have a table where small group work can happen, we're in a different space literal spaces than we were 10 years ago. And that's not to minimize the impact of small classes on, that relationship, right? But it does matter that if kids can fit comfortably. That is markedly different now than it was, and at Crocker Farm it will be different very soon. I think that is a consideration that we have to think about as well. Bless you.
Thank you.
So I think okay to go on. I'm just about done. So just some additional advantages that have come up about moving in 2026 that we've heard. Transitions would occur simultaneously. By transitions, I'm talking about both the building project transitions as well as 6th grade. And so there was a lot of response about temporary changes, like, oh, I'll go to this school for 3 years and then go somewhere else, but with your kid or adult being staff member or parent. Parents want to feel connected to their school, and so the concept of these kind of like 2 tiers of changes was something that there was a negative response to. It also allows us to potentially, knock on wood again, resolve some bureaucratic issues and see if we can get a more integrated grades 6 through 8 middle school, at least in some way, shape, or form, because I do think we've heard that a lot from middle school staff as well. It allows elementary staff, as I mentioned earlier, to learn more about the middle school, have more opportunities to visit, talk to people, and gauge their interest. And related to bathroom spaces, a conversation we had in a joint meeting, maybe to explore some other alternative solutions as it relates to that. So in short, my recommendation for your consideration is that the Amherst School Committee change the timeline of moving sixth grade from fall 2023 to fall 2026. And, I propose a timeline, which, I'm sure there'll be lots of thoughts about, but just that we, instead of just responding to people who reach out, solicit stakeholder feedback regarding the timeline of moving sixth grade. I'd ask you to come back, on the 17th, which is like our next currently scheduled meeting, and take a vote on that. And I think everybody, that's probably as late as we can, it's probably pushing it already, to be honest with you. But I don't think we could make a decision later than February 17th, both for students, families, but also just logistically, budgetarily, we would need that. I think the chair has been in touch with me about some potential changes in budget, so I think I'll defer to her in a second on that, maybe that March 15th not being the date. But we try to still get, by March 24th, initial staffing, placement, location, and position, because as I mentioned, even if sixth grade does stay at the elementary level, we still are rebalancing. There still will be movement between the three schools. And so we want to let people know in time to understand what those changes are and be ready for them.
I just want to clarify, the meeting's the 16th
Ooh.
of February,
I apologize.
unless we want to meet on a Friday.
I apologize. I do not. I'll make that edit, but thank you. And that's the end. I think the last slide just says questions. Yes.
Yep.
So I'll leave this one up. But that's the end of my presentation. Again, I apologize for the length of it, but I think there's a lot of information, data, and I want to thank, the last thing I'll say before there's more questions is I want to thank, not just Tammy and Julio, but Derek and Jen over at Crocker Farm, and Nick and Allison at Wildwood, Doreen, other people, Mary and Faye who are in the room, Katie from ELL perspective. Lots of people we've been meeting a lot over those last couple weeks, and emailing and communicating a lot, so that we could come up with the data that we were able to come up with tonight, as well as the recommendations. So it really has been a team effort, and I get the honestly good fortune of being able to present it. Wherever it goes, but it's been a collective effort and lots of thoughts and feedback throughout.
Thank you. Yeah, it's thorough, definitely. So long, but worthy for the gravity of the decision.
Thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, no need to apologize for length. This is the appropriate level of thoroughness. In fact, I think this is one of the things you do best, Mike, is when there's a major decision that crosses a lot of different areas and requires expertise and summary for fiscal, for budget, for values. You do a really good job of synthesizing that. I know this is reflective of a lot of people's effort, and I really appreciate our Fort River leadership team being here tonight to answer questions. But no, I appreciate that, the way that you do that. So I like the timeline. Just one little note, so the one of the benefits of potentially providing additional time to resolve issues that prevent implementation of a more integrated and fiscally efficient school. So that's a little different than some of the principles PLES, that we've been talking about before, of wanting it to be substantially separate. And the way that it's phrased here seems to beg the question of updating the regional agreement. I mean, for those of you following the bouncing ball of school committee meetings at home, this is a different district than 7 to 12, and there are a lot of legal issues to resolve if there was going to be a much tighter integration of 6 to 8 that could potentially mean opening up the regional school agreement, the agreement at 7 to 12 with our other member towns. So I would just say put a pin in that in your mind. It doesn't have to be like, obviously in the next couple weeks, but if you're serious that you think that that's something that we should pursue, that's something we want to get the ball rolling on much sooner rather than later, right? Because updating a regional agreement, is as you've said before, is a multi-year process, and so we wouldn't want to just find this slide deck a few years from now and say, oh yeah, we're gonna look into that, right? So.
Yeah, I would second that.
Can I just
Yeah,
caution that there's a quorum of the regional school committee here, so I think
Yes.
I would probably just, no problem with Peter's comment, but I'm not sure that there should be discussion. I'm sorry to be, I hate being the OML police, but, or feel like it. It's not my preferred role, but since there is a quorum here and not a called for meeting, it's something that maybe I can bring to the regional chair for future consideration. I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
I would second that in terms of let's bring that to the region to have that conversation, because I think I'm okay in saying that because it was referenced in the presentation about sort of the teachers' feedback about the collaboration benefits of sort of being more integrated into a middle school. And I recall sort of having, I think in my role in another committee, so I won't go any further, but I recall that was one of the things that we had talked about as being a benefit of sort of moving our sixth grade into a middle school environment, was not just from the student perspective, but from the teacher professional development and curriculum collaboration. So we're kind of missing that when we keep it as an elementary school.
Yeah, and if I could comment on that. First of all, I apologize for cutting you
No,
off.
thank
Hopefully
you.
that was not too rude. But I think that's the thing that was the aha moment for me, was really hearing from teachers, sixth grade teachers, current sixth grade teachers directly about, separate from where bathrooms are located and what doors stay open or closed, just, feeling a little limited, more than a little limited in terms of the collaboration piece, and wanting to feel part of a larger environment. So, there's the student piece, but I think exactly what you said came through. It's really the adult professional learning community, and I think both middle school teachers and our sixth grade teachers really looking for that. And, I think, sort of some constraints didn't allow for that to be as much part of the model as folks would have hoped.
Jennifer.
So what is the plan for soliciting stakeholder feedback? Because February 17th will be here before you know it.
That's what we should talk about, right? I mean that quite literally. But that's what we should talk about. So, my thinking, sorry, this is going to keep happening until I figure out how to make my PC not go to sleep quicker. So it'll refresh. So we've spent a lot of time tonight in a meeting asking really detailed questions, and I think it's hard to communicate the complexity of what we're talking about that well. And I think this video of this meeting actually might do a pretty good job of it, to be frank, more than the slides. So, we have a lot of surveys out now. I referenced a couple earlier. My initial thought was more of an open-ended, qualitative kind of tool that just asked people what questions they had, what leanings they had, how they're feeling about kind of this reconsideration, more than sort of more corporate style quantitative survey. I think it's really hard. The complexity, I think, is thank you for your compliment before, Peter. The complexity is real, and you all live in this stuff all the time as your role as school committee chair members. And certainly we do as people who are leaders in schools or the district. And so I guess I'm struggling with a bit, because I do want to gather feedback, but I'm struggling a bit on the education side so that people have enough information to feel like they can confidently offer. So I'm all ears in terms of feedback from the committee or ideas about how we might approach gathering feedback over the next couple of weeks.
I might offer a suggestion of splitting it into maybe 2 phases of feedback, because part of the feedback is thinking about sort of how we're going to get there, and part of it is just bluntly on the timing change, right? Because I think, if I think about the feedback and how we're going to use that in making a decision, the big reasons why we were even looking at this aren't going to change regardless of what the feedback is. And I'm not saying we shouldn't ask for community feedback. That's not at all what I'm advocating. I just sort of want to put it in the perspective of what are the major things that we need to consider in making this decision, because what your rationale for proposing even in moving this is already acknowledging the differences in terms of feelings and thoughts on this already, and yet we still face an $800,000 deficit in staffing inefficiencies if we move forward. So that's not going to change. So I just sort of, I'm not saying don't do it, because it's valuable, it's helpful, but I think maybe thinking about sort of how we're going to use it and what we might do, because it might be a really simple survey to have in time for that conversation on the 16th of February versus a really in-depth, deep stakeholder feedback. I think through if everybody was, if the community was adamantly against it, the delay, that might change that. But if it comes in mixed as what we've seen, I'm not sure that that's going to change sort of the recommendation. It's just sort of where my head is on. Mike.
I can wait till after. I was going to respond to Allison, but if you want to.
I mean, I would just say briefly that, I mean, maybe this is splitting hairs, but, you know, I certainly want to hear from people about this, right? And we already have to some degree. And I think, Mike, your idea of including, highlighting this, you know, as your primary topic in the newsletter and saying, you hear the slides. If you want to include the link to the meeting, go ahead. I don't know how you know, maybe I mean, I do think this is a good conversation. I don't know whether the school committee does the best job of explaining it. But you know, so I do want to hear that feedback. I don't know whether we need to go to the next level of like, and here is a survey, and click on this Google link, and then answer these 7 questions. Which sort of, because I always hesitate because I want feedback to be part of the entire process, but I also don't want to give the idea that like this is totally up in the air and we really want to hear from and we don't know, like, you're giving a pretty strong recommendation, and from our discussion tonight, there isn't strong objection. And so, you know, I always struggle process-wise with how to frame that to the community. You know, I think the qualitative general kind of feedback is always very useful because we're talking about how do we implement, how do we communicate, you know, and then the details, you know, things that you might not be aware of. But that was a longer comment than I intended.
Mike?
So just this conversation is making me wonder if doing, you know, live or virtual forums where families could receive not as long a presentation, it might be the same slides, but, you know, a quarter the length of information, are able to ask questions and offer feedback, as well as having an opportunity, you know, even if it's not a 7-question survey, but just, you know, having, like, if you want to offer feedback, here's, you know, an opportunity. But, you know, maybe it's more of giving people an opportunity to understand a little more and then be able to ask questions live and more dynamically versus a more passive survey tool as being the primary. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud here. I'm really open to, you know, I mean it when I'm saying I'm struggling with it, because I the same way I think we're all trying to figure out what's the best approach. I do think it's important that people know what's happening. Like by it means this discussion is happening, not the change that's to be determined. I don't know. I mean, I'm really open to sort of ideas. I know there's some building project forums this week, so I also know people might be surveyed out. They might also be forums out after the next 2 days. So I want to be reasonable and respectful of people's time as well.
It's occurring to me, because our next agenda item is talking about sort of getting feedback on the budget. And because this is very strongly related to budget, right? Like we're having this discussion because of that $800,000 deficit that we're facing for the next budget year. I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to combine the two, and to a certain extent, because part of teeing up this conversation is talking about that budget. And because it is more of a general survey, I'm not saying, I also like the idea of sort of presenting the information and inviting folks that have strong opinions either way to reach out in some way, as opposed to a formal survey. So I do like that, because again, I think I just go back to how are we going to use it? Because if it's going to be more helpful in thinking about how do we approach and implement sort of the pullback on the timeline, and sort of, you know, we just want to make sure that there's things, or, you know, or is it something that we want to make sure that there's something that we haven't considered that somebody raises, right? As opposed to thorough feedback to help us make a decision. So it's not like the school start time change, for example, where we really did truly want to hear, and that really influenced our decision. This is more sort of, is there something that we haven't thought about? Is there something that we're missing? Are there stronger feelings than we already can see and hear. I don't have an answer, but I just sort of wanted to throw that out there, is that maybe there's a way to sort of weave part of that into the sort of budget input form, and maybe have just the open invitation to reach out if for strong feelings.
And that works for me. I think that makes sense. I mean, I would certainly, make this presentation quite a bit shorter so that it can be more open to feedback, and not less presentation, more listening. And I think weaving it in with budget, to me, makes sense, because that's one of the, if you look at like reconsiderations, I think that's number one on my list, right? So it is connected. I don't know how the rest of the committee feels about that. So are people okay if the chair and I try to work on what that might look like? I guess we can talk about it a little more in the next agenda. Okay. Thank you.
Good. So actually, if you can keep that up, because of the dates.
Sure.
So one of the things, before diving into that budget feedback form, because that is our next agenda item, so in looking at this, given, we have 2 meetings before we have to submit the budget to the town manager on April 1st, I think is the date, about April. Yeah. I don't know if that's a weekday, but on or around April 1st. And there's, so we only have 2 meetings between now, or at least that are on the calendar right now, between now and then. One of those meetings has to include the budget hearing. And the budget hearing, the full budget, the complete budget, has to be published 2 weeks before that hearing, in order sort of to give the community time. That's actually in our policy, I think, or in the statute. So one of the suggestions that Mike referenced that I was communicating with him about was the idea of adding a meeting in there, that we use the February 16th meeting still to hear sort of the complete budget. And then 2 weeks after that, we have the budget hearing. And then on the March 15th, we vote. So that's one suggestion. Or we have the hearing on the 15th and vote a week later. I personally sort of like the first solution, but it doesn't have to be that way, because we have 2 weeks between the 15th and the 1st in order to vote on the budget. It doesn't have to happen on the 5th, 2 weeks ahead. I don't know how long it takes. I think unless we make changes, it's a matter of just forwarding the documents to Paul. So it's not like there's a major submission timeline. So I saw some nodding heads out of the corners of my eye when I suggested adding the meeting.
So the added meeting would be in between the February 17th and March 15th?
Correct.
Okay.
Which I think, let's see, I wrote.
March 2nd.
Would be either February 28th or March, because it's February 16th is a Thursday, not a Tuesday. So February 28th is the Tuesday, but it could be March 2nd if we wanted it on a Thursday.
That works for me.
Is that Peter?
So yeah, I like your first suggestion, but if someone feels really strongly about the other one, I think that would be viable as well.
Yeah. I think if we plan for the hearing on the 28th, and there's things that we've discussed in between there, it gives us also the opportunity to review it on the 15th and not vote on that. If there's additional changes or things that we want to do, then we can sort of, if I'm just thinking from the conversation, from what happened last year, that we wanted more time and we wanted to look at an alternate, and we're kind of doing that on the fly. If we needed to, that gives us that cushion that if we needed to add another meeting before the 1st, we can. Mike?
So my current schedule has another committee meeting on the 28th.
So the 2nd?
I think would be, unless maybe the Amherst and regional chairs could meet offline and and I'm happy to help with just to look at that week and what
Okay.
makes sense.
Yep.
If that's okay?
Yep.
I mean, because since everyone here sits on both committees, it affects everybody
Right, right.
in terms of their schedules anyways the same.
Yep.
Is that okay? Sorry, I'm just capitalizing because you're
Yes.
both sitting next to each other.
That works.
Yes.
That works.
We have good relations. I feel comfortable talking to that chair. Mhm. Okay, so moving on to the actual budget input form. I did not make any changes to that, so it was late at night when we were looking at it before, so I just attached the draft in there again. It's pretty much identical to the regional school committee did regarding the regional school district, with the obvious changes to the names of the schools and references to elementary school district as opposed to regional school district. There was the suggestion at the last meeting to change in question 10, thank you, high levels of achievement to high levels of academic instruction, I think was what my notes said, as opposed to achievement. And so then the other thing that we just talked about in the prior agenda item was weaving in a question. Thank you. Thanks for joining us tonight. Weaving in a question or two related to the 6th grade to the middle school timing. Mike?
So I wonder if on question 10, instruction in art, music, technology, we should also include physical education
Yep.
and I'm trying to think how far to go with it. But to include all the specials,
Yep.
I mean, instrumental music's a little different. But to make sure we include library and physical education in there. Not that they're all the same, but I think we think of them as a unit, a
Yep.
specials team, so
No, that's good.
thank you.
Any other thoughts? Peter?
I mean, the bare bones simplest way to integrate the 6th grade feedback would be either at the very beginning or the very end.
Mm-hmm.
Just add a statement saying, something that's phrased a little more polished than this, but, where school committee is also actively looking at, delaying the move that has been voted for the 6th grade move to this date. Information is available here, link to the presentation and the video. School committee is actively soliciting feedback on this decision, either a link to an email to school committee or just a free text box. But I mean, that would be the simplest way to do it that didn't seem shoehorned in somewhere else here.
I was thinking the open-ended would be the most helpful.
And I would think at the beginning.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And when what's not on this is there was just a sentence or two that we gave to Deb to include in the email, and I think it was in the survey itself that sort of described why we're doing this. And I think that's a good spot to sort of also include that piece, sort of just to tweak that wording there. So I will work with Debbie to get the Survey Monkey sort of created, which should be pretty straightforward since it's pretty much a clone with some edits, and get that out. If not Friday, then maybe next week, early next week, so that we can have input for the 16th. Sounds good. Anything else? Peter?
The rating scale on number 10 should equal the number of rows.
Yes.
Whether that ends up being 7 or 8 or whatever it is.
Yes, thank you. Where's my notes?
turn the screens off. I don't think we'll need them anymore.
Yeah.
That's okay.
So future agenda planning,
Good time.
on the 16th, which is a Thursday, we'll have our first look at the full budget for FY '24. We'll, I don't think we'll need second quarter budget because we did that tonight, right? Yeah.
Ready to go through it again if you'd like, but.
We will, school building committee update from designers is listed, and then the decision on the 6th grade to the middle school timeline and staffing.
I'm just catching up for a second. I apologize. It's funny that I would think the technology here is needs catching up after we've been on Google Meets for
I know.
as long as we have, but that's where I am.
And the connection seems a little slow too, so.
All right. Okay, so
And then TBD but it's that week of the 28th, whether it's the 28th or the 2nd will be our budget hearing. No other topics for that. And then our meeting on the 14th will be budget with anticipated vote, as well as literacy programs and dyslexia screener update. And I would imagine another school building update.
yeah, so I want to check on the 16th and whether we're doing that update or not. So let me check with Donna just to confirm that.
Okay.
Yeah. I think that's right. I just want to double check the date. And in terms of the policy that we talked about earlier on class size, I didn't know where that fit into people's thinking, where, just chronologically when it made sense to have that conversation.
Is that, well, yeah, because it's related to elementary school, because it doesn't have to necessarily be a regional driven, it's.
Not a regional
yeah.
policy.
Yeah,
but-
okay. So, we could potentially do it on the 16th, at least have that initial conversation about principles, or do you want to push that to the 14th?
I think that's a lot on the 16th to have.
Okay.
So whether that ends up on the 28th/2nd or on the 14th, I think those would be reasonable dates for that conversation, more than the 16th from my opinion.
Okay.
I think there was a committee member with their hand up.
Thank you. I don't have eyes in the back of my head. Peter?
No, I was just saying, so in terms of scheduling that item, obviously it's important to talk about. I don't see it as like essential that we get through it to a degree prior to the budget vote, for example. Like, I don't feel like I need an updated policy, for example, before I vote on next year's budget. So, to whatever degree, I know that when you and Doug are preparing, these budgets and region is happening at the same time, it's ridiculous tax time level work for you all. So, and class size isn't something I want you to take just 10 minutes preparing for, right? So, I'm just personally, I'm fine if that has to get bumped to later in the spring. That's okay with me. I don't know how other people feel.
Ben?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that we have a lot to focus on up until April 11th or beyond would be fine with me. That, I don't think it necessarily affects the budget decisions or a potential vote on a move. Or it could, I guess.
Okay.
Okay.
My, whether it's March or April, I think, I don't think it's a two-meeting conversation, so my preference would be to schedule it sooner than later, just because it probably will be something that we'll want to stretch over a few meetings. So we can look at sort of how full that schedule is in the March, and so March or April I think would be good, so that we can hit it in a couple meetings this spring. Okay. Warrant report. I don't think that I have any. I have some waiting for me to sign. Saw those come in today. But no, I don't have any new reports to read. And we have a gift. I move that we accept the following gift from the League of Women Voters, number 1379, to support gym rental book sale donation, use for civics and women's studies books, for a value of total value of $600. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Allison, second by Ben. We'll take is there any further discussion? Take a vote. Irv?
Aye.
Peter?
Peter, I.
Ben?
Ben, aye?
Allison, aye. Jennifer?
Aye.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. And now I'm going to move that the Amherst School Committee enter executive session in accordance with the Open Meeting Law, MGLC 30A, Section 21A, to conduct collective bargaining sessions and to discuss strategy with respect to collective bargaining or litigation with APEA if an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the bargaining or litigation position of the public body, and the chair so declares, and I declare, with no intention of returning to open session. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Allison, seconded by Peter, and we will take a roll call vote. And I'm taking roll call because Irv is remote. Jennifer?
Aye.
Allison, aye. Irv?
Aye.
Ben?
Ben, aye.
Peter?
Peter, I.
And so we will now adjourn into executive session. Thank you.
So some of you haven't done this. We usually use that back room under the clock for executive session. So Allison, I don't know if your computer travels. It looks like
Yes.
it does. So
Yes. Did they close up the, there was a pass-through that we discovered. Do you remember?
oh yes, I do. I don't know if it has, but I don't think there's mobs of people.
No.
for this. You don't- Thank you. Have a good night.
Probably should bring all the stuff, right?
Yeah, unless, I mean, nobody's here, so.
Allison, I'm skipping this, so have fun.
Thank you. I mean, thanks for letting me know.
You can have some sandwiches if you want.
Irvin,
Chocolate covered pretzels?
taking you into the other room.
You were so on time, by the way. Agenda planning, you were 1 minute off. Amazing. Crazy good.
I was gonna make a whole bunch of timing jokes, but I realized can't really do that.